White teacher puts super glue in black student's hair, unaware his father is the school principal. The morning sun streamed through the windows of room 203 at Springfield Middle School, casting long shadows across the freshly polished floors. A young boy sat quietly at his desk, his fingers nervously tracing the edges of his new textbook. His dark eyes scanned every detail of the classroom, from the motivational posters on the walls to the neat rows of desks gradually filling up with students. This was Alex's first day at his new school, and everything felt unfamiliar. The hallways were wider, the lockers were a different shade of blue, and even the air smelled different, a mix of fresh paint and lemon-scented cleaner. He reached up, gently touching his hair, which had been carefully styled into neat locks by his grandmother just the day before. "You look handsome," she had said, her warm smile filling him with the confidence he needed for this new chapter. What none of his classmates knew, and what the school staff hadn't been told, was that Alex's father was actually their new principal, Mr. Richardson. It had been a family decision to keep this information private for the first few weeks. "Give yourself a chance to make friends on your own terms," his dad had suggested over breakfast that morning, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror before they left home separately. As students continued filing into the classroom, Alex noticed how they instinctively formed their usual groups. Friends who had known each other since kindergarten, sharing summer stories and comparing class schedules. He pulled out his notebook, the fresh pages ready for a new start, just as the teacher walked in. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the class, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, lips pressed into a thin line. As she took attendance, her eyes briefly paused on Alex's name, a slight hesitation in her expression so subtle that only someone paying close attention would notice. Throughout the morning, Alex did his best to blend in. He raised his hand when he knew the answer, stayed silent when he didn't, and followed every instruction precisely. But he couldn't ignore how Mrs. Thompson's gaze lingered on him longer than it did on the others, or how her smiles never quite reached her eyes when she addressed him. During their first writing assignment, Alex carefully crafted an essay about his summer vacation. He described a family trip to the Science Museum, the experiments they conducted in the interactive lab, and his dream of becoming a scientist. But when he handed in his paper, Mrs. Thompson barely glanced at it before placing it at the bottom of the stack. At lunch, a friendly boy named David invited Alex to sit with him and his friends. They chatted about video games, their favorite subjects, and the upcoming school science fair. For the first time that day, Alex felt at ease. Maybe this new school wouldn't be so bad after all. But when they returned to class, he noticed Mrs. Thompson watching him again with that same strange look. As she handed back the graded essays, Alex's heart sank. His paper was covered in red marks, the grade at the top a discouraging A-. He had never received anything lower than A++ before. Glancing around, he saw other students comparing their grades, mostly A's and B's. David, who had written a similar-length essay about his summer at soccer camp, had received an A. Swallowing his disappointment, Alex tucked the paper into his folder, trying to ignore the tight knot forming in his stomach. As the afternoon progressed, small moments added up. Mrs. Thompson interrupted him twice while he was answering a question, something she didn't do to other students. When he asked to sharpen his pencil, she made him wait until 3 other students had gone first. During art class, she passed by his desk without offering help, though she stopped to assist every other student in his row. By the time the final bell rang, Alex was exhausted. As he packed up his books, he debated whether to tell his father about his day. He knew his dad would want to know, but something held him back. Maybe tomorrow would be better. Maybe Mrs. Thompson was just having a rough day. Maybe he was imagining things. Walking down the hallway toward the exit, Alex passed his father's office. Through the glass panel in the door, he saw Mr. Richardson deep in conversation with another teacher. Their eyes met, and his dad gave him a slight, encouraging nod. Alex forced a small smile in return, gripping his backpack a little tighter. That evening, when his mother asked about his first day, Alex kept his response brief. It was okay, but as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something more challenging than he had expected. Still, His grandmother's words echoed in his mind.
Standhalt.
Be proud of who you are. Tomorrow was a new day, another chance to prove himself, and he was determined to face it with courage. As the weeks passed at Springfield Middle School, the crisp autumn air brought changes, not just to the leaves outside, but to the atmosphere inside room 203. Each passing day, the weight in the classroom grew heavier, and Mrs. Thompson's behavior toward Alex became harder to ignore, even for his classmates. One morning, while Alex was solving a math problem at the board, Mrs. Thompson stood behind him, tapping her foot impatiently. "We don't have all day," she said, her voice sharp enough to make several students glance up from their notebooks. Alex's hand trembled slightly as he wrote the final answer, which was completely correct. But instead of acknowledging his work, Mrs. Thompson simply said, "Sit down." During that same class, when Lisa, a girl with blonde pigtails, solved a similar problem, more slowly and with 2 mistakes, Mrs. Thompson's tone softened. "Take your time, dear. Math can be tricky, but you're doing just fine," she said, her voice suddenly warm and encouraging. The contrast was so striking that David, Alex's friend, shot him a concerned look from across the room. At lunch that day, David finally spoke up. "My mom's a teacher at another school," he said, pushing his apple around his tray. "She says teachers aren't supposed to treat kids differently like that." Alex just shrugged, trying to appear unbothered, but inside, his stomach was in knots. The situation escalated further during their history presentations. Each student was assigned to speak about their family heritage. When Alex proudly shared stories about his grandmother's civil rights activism and his family's deep roots in the community, Mrs. Thompson interrupted him halfway through. "That's enough," she cut in, even though he still had 2 minutes left according to the timer. "We need to give others a chance." Yet, when the next student rambled on for an extra 3 minutes about their summer vacation, completely off topic, Mrs. Thompson beamed and called it wonderfully detailed. Word of Mrs. Thompson's behavior began spreading beyond room 203. Other teachers noticed how she made comments about Alex's hair during faculty lunch breaks. "I don't understand why they can't just wear their hair normally," she would say, loud enough for several colleagues to hear. Most of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but few spoke up. Mr. Chun, the science teacher, was one of the few who showed visible concern. He started finding excuses to walk past room 203 during Mrs. Thompson's class. Once, he even stepped inside to borrow some chalk, right after hearing her raised voice through the door. His presence seemed to temporarily ease the tension, but he couldn't always be there. One afternoon, while grading papers, Mrs. Thompson dramatically held up Alex's essay at arm's length, as if it were contaminated. "The handwriting is absolutely impossible to read," she announced to the class, despite the fact that Alex's writing was as neat as anyone else's. She marked his paper with a D, even though David, after reading it, had said it was one of the best essays he'd ever seen. Other students began noticing patterns too. How Mrs. Thompson wrinkled her nose when walking past Alex's desk, how she ignored his raised hand during discussions, and how she blamed him for any classroom noise, even when he was silently reading. Some students started standing up for Alex in small but meaningful ways. They would purposely point out when he got an answer right or ask him for help with homework where Mrs. Thompson could see. A few even changed their hairstyles in solidarity, though none of them fully grasped the deeper significance of what was happening. Despite the tension in room 203, Alex continued to thrive in other classes. In Mr. Chen's science class, his experiments were always thorough and creative. His art projects were displayed in the hallway, and in PE he was often picked first for teams. But in Mrs. Thompson's class, his grades kept mysteriously slipping. At home, Alex began having trouble sleeping. He would lie awake, rehearsing answers to simple questions, terrified of making even the smallest mistake in class. His mother noticed that he was quieter at dinner, pushing his food around his plate instead of eagerly sharing stories about his day, as he used to. Some mornings, as Alex walked to school, he saw his father's car already parked in the lot. He knew his dad was working hard to improve the school, holding meetings about inclusive education and student welfare. The irony wasn't lost on him. Yet, he still couldn't bring himself to speak up about what was happening in room 203. Mrs. Thompson's recent parent-teacher conferences had started raising eyebrows. Parents reported that she seemed to have two entirely different personalities, warmly praising some students while constantly finding faults with others. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone, except those who had the power to do something about it. The tension was building like a pot about to boil over. Other teachers exchanged uneasy glances in the hallways. Students whispered among themselves. Even the school secretary had begun discreetly keeping a record of the incidents she overheard. Everyone knew something had to give. They just didn't know when or how. Through it all, Alex held on to his grandmother's words about dignity and strength. Each morning, Alex walked into class with his head held high, his homework complete, and his spirit unshaken. But even the strongest spirit can only bend so far before something has to give, and change was coming to room 203 sooner than anyone expected. The art room buzzed with excitement that Wednesday afternoon. Colorful posters for the upcoming fall festival covered one wall, while the warm October sun cast golden squares on the floor through the large windows. Students chatted softly as they worked on their craft projects, creating decorations for the school hallways. Alex sat at his usual spot, carefully cutting orange paper into perfectly shaped pumpkins. His project was coming along well. He had already finished 2 pumpkins and was starting on a third. Beside him, David struggled with his scissors, producing what he claimed was a modern art interpretation of a fall leaf. Mrs. Thompson moved between the desks, carrying a box of craft supplies. She had been unusually quiet that day, her lips pressed into a thin line as she handed out materials. When she reached Alex's desk, she lingered a moment too long, her eyes scanning his neatly arranged workspace. "I see you're actually following instructions for once," she remarked, her voice carrying that familiar sharpness that made Alex's shoulders tense. Keeping his focus on his work, he pretended to concentrate on getting the curve of the pumpkin stem just right. A few students glanced up but quickly looked away. They had grown accustomed to these moments of tension, but that didn't make them any easier to witness. The room grew noticeably quieter. "We need some glue over here," a voice called from the back of the room. Mrs. Thompson turned away, and Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He reached for his water bottle, taking a sip to steady himself. The next few minutes passed peacefully. Alex finished his third pumpkin and began working on a border design for his display. The classroom chatter had resumed, filled with discussions about weekend plans and the upcoming science fair. Then he felt it. Something cold and wet landed on the top of his head. For a split second, Alex thought someone had spilled water, but the sensation was different, thicker, stickier. His heartbeat quickened as he reached up to touch his hair. Mrs. Thompson stood behind him, an open bottle in her hand. The strong chemical scent hit his nose before his fingers confirmed the truth. Super glue. Not the washable craft glue they had been using for their projects, but industrial strength adhesive from the supply cabinet. The room fell eerily silent. Someone gasped. A pencil clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed classroom. "Oh my," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice dripping with false concern. "What a terrible accident. I must have grabbed the wrong bottle." Alex sat frozen, his hands still touching the sticky mess in his hair. His carefully maintained locks, the ones his grandmother had helped him style since he was little, the ones that connected him to his family's heritage, were now coated in fast-drying adhesive. From somewhere behind him came the unmistakable click of a phone camera. Then another. Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted for just a moment, a flicker of something like panic crossing her face. "I'll get some paper towels," she said quickly, turning away. But everyone in the room knew that paper towels wouldn't fix this. Super glue wasn't like regular glue. It couldn't simply be washed out. David pushed back his chair abruptly. "I'm getting the nurse," he declared, his voice tight with anger. Before Mrs. Thompson could protest, he was already out the door. Other students started moving, too. Emmy, who sat in front of Alex, gathered her courage and spoke up. "That wasn't the wrong bottle," she said firmly. The craft glue is in plastic bottles with orange caps. That's the super glue from the locked cabinet. More voices joined in, overlapping. You had to use a key to get that. I saw you take it out before class. You didn't even offer glue to anyone else. Mrs. Thompson's face had gone pale. She must have realized, too late, just how many witnesses were in the room. How many phones had captured the incident? How many students were finally finding their voices? Alex still hadn't moved. The glue was beginning to harden, tugging uncomfortably at his scalp. But somehow, sitting there in that moment, he felt something shift inside him. The fear and anxiety of the past weeks transformed into something else. A quiet strength. A certainty that this time, things would have to change. Through the open classroom door came the sound of hurried footsteps. The nurse would be arriving soon, and with her, the questions would begin. What happened? Who was responsible? Why? And somewhere in the building, Alex's father sat in his office, unaware that his role as principal was about to collide with his role as a parent in a way that would change everything. Mrs. Thompson stood stiffly by her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she pretended to look for paper towels. But the truth was already plain to see. The bottle of super glue still clutched in her hand, the security camera in the corner of the room, the dozens of students who had witnessed everything, and the determination in their eyes that said, this time they wouldn't stay silent. The school nurse's office was usually quiet in the afternoons, but not today. The news spread through the building like wildfire, carried in whispered conversations and urgent text messages. Students passing by the office slowed their steps, straining to catch glimpses through the frosted glass window. Inside the nurse's office, Mrs. Baker worked carefully, using warm water and gentle hands as she tried to assess the damage to Alex's hair. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes betrayed her anger as she meticulously documented everything on her phone, taking photos for the inevitable investigation. It's starting to burn a little, Alex murmured, wincing as she touched a particularly sticky spot. The sharp chemical scent of the superglue filled the small room, mixing with the usual antiseptic smell of the nurse's office. Outside in the hallway, David paced back and forth. He had taken it upon himself to guard the door, turning away curious onlookers while waiting for the principal to arrive. Several other students from the art class had followed him, forming a protective circle around the nurse's office. They were busy sharing the video clips they had recorded, ensuring that multiple copies existed. Mrs. Thompson stood stiffly by the wall, her earlier confidence completely drained. She kept smoothing out her skirt with unsteady hands, flinching slightly each time footsteps echoed down the hall. It was an accident, she muttered, as if trying to convince herself. Just a simple mix-up with the bottles. Emmy, who had stayed behind to give her statement, spoke up from her chair. The craft glue is in plastic bottles, she repeated, her voice stronger now. The super glue is kept in a locked cabinet. You needed a key to get it. Mrs. Baker paused in her work and turned to face Mrs. Thompson directly. Super glue can cause chemical burns, she said, her professional tone laced with steel. This isn't just a simple mistake. This is serious. Just then, the door swung open. Everyone expected to see the principal, but instead, Mr. Chun, the science teacher, hurried inside. His eyes darted from Alex to the bottle of super glue on the counter, and his expression darkened. Without saying a word, he pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. The principal is in a district meeting, he explained, glancing up from his phone. I just sent him an urgent message. He should be here any minute. None of them knew just how personal this message would be for the principal. The minutes crawled by. Mrs. Baker continued her careful work, documenting every detail. Mr. Chun remained by the door, his usually cheerful face now set in serious lines. More teachers had gathered in the hallway, their hushed conversations tinged with shock and concern. Then, the sound of quick, purposeful footsteps echoed down the corridor. The crowd outside parted, and the door swung open. Principal Richardson stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. For a brief moment, everything froze. Mrs. Thompson's face drained of color as recognition dawned. She looked from Alex to the principal, then back again, the connection finally clicking into place. The same warm brown eyes, the same straight nose, the same quiet dignity. How had she never noticed before? "Dad," Alex said softly. The single word seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. The principal's face shifted in an instant. For a fleeting second, raw pain and fury flashed across his features as he took in the sight of his son. Then, with visible effort, he forced his professional mask back into place. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly controlled, yet vibrating with authority. "Mrs. Baker, please continue assisting my son. Mr. Chun, would you contact the district office? We'll need a substitute teacher immediately." Then he turned to Mrs. Thompson, who had pressed herself against the wall as if she could will herself to disappear. "Mrs. Thompson, please go to my office and wait there." The students watched in silent awe as their principal handled the crisis with calm efficiency. Even while his own child sat before him, suffering from chemicals burning his scalp, they saw him make phone calls, document everything, and ensure proper procedures were followed, all while casting concerned glances at Alex every few minutes. Parents began arriving, alerted by their children's messages. Their angry voices carried through the hallways, reaching all the way to the front office. The school secretary was overwhelmed with non-stop phone calls. Even the superintendent herself was on her way. Through it all, Alex sat quietly in the nurse's office, pressing an ice pack to his burning scalp. He watched his father navigate this impossible situation, being both a parent and a principal, and felt a new kind of pride growing inside him. The secret they had kept for weeks had finally come out, but not in a way either of them could have predicted. By late afternoon, the hallways had emptied, but the story was far from over. Social media was already buzzing with the news. Community leaders were demanding action. The school board had scheduled an emergency meeting. In the quiet of the nurse's office, father and son finally had a moment alone. Principal Richardson pulled up a chair beside Alex, his professional composure cracking slightly as he gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "I had no idea things had gotten this bad." Alex looked up at his father, seeing the pain and determination in his eyes. "I know, Dad," he replied, "but now everyone else knows too. Maybe that's what needed to happen." Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the nurse's office floor. Both father and son knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges they would have to face together. But for now, they sat in quiet understanding, their shared strength growing in the silence. The next morning arrived with a sense of urgency that hung in the air like approaching storm clouds. Principal Richardson sat in his office, his desk cluttered with papers, his phone constantly buzzing with messages and calls. Outside, news vans were already parked near the school gates, their satellite dishes stretching into the overcast sky. Down the hall, in the conference room, Mrs. Thompson sat alone, staring at her hands. She had been there since dawn, watching through the window as teachers and staff arrived, their expressions grim. The school board members would be arriving soon for an emergency meeting, and she knew her 20-year teaching career was likely over. The superintendent, Dr. Collins, was the first to arrive. Her usually impeccable suit was slightly rumpled, a sign of the long night she had spent handling press inquiries and responding to furious emails from parents. As she walked through the main office, the secretary handed her a thick folder, printed copies of all the complaints that had been filed against Mrs. Thompson over the years. "How did we miss this?" Dr. Collins muttered, flipping through the pages. The records went back 5 years, subtle discrimination, unexplained grade changes, complaints that had been submitted and somehow forgotten. The pattern was unmistakable now, but only because someone had finally connected the dots. One by one, the school board members arrived, their faces serious as they were escorted to the conference room. Each of them had seen the viral video, shaky phone footage showing Mrs. Thompson deliberately pouring super glue onto Alex's hair. The timestamps and multiple angles left no room for doubt. From his office window, Principal Richardson watched as more cars pulled into the parking lot. Community leaders, civil rights advocates, and parents were gathering, a clear statement that this incident would not be ignored. His phone buzzed again, a message from his wife, letting him know that she had taken Alex to the doctor to check for any chemical burns. A soft knock at his door made him turn. Mr. Chun stood there, holding a stack of papers. "Sir," he said quietly, "the students wanted you to have these." He set the papers on the desk, dozens of written statements from students in Mrs. Thompson's class, each detailing incidents they had witnessed in recent weeks. "She always picked on Alex," one statement read, "but we were too scared to say anything because she was the teacher. I saw her change his grades," another student had written. Once, she erased his answer and wrote a different one just so she could mark it wrong. Principal Richardson read each statement carefully, his heart heavy with the realization that his son had endured this mistreatment while he worked just down the hall, completely unaware. The professional distance he had tried to maintain had inadvertently given Mrs. Thompson the space to act without consequence. At exactly 10 a.m., the conference room doors closed for the emergency board meeting. Mrs. Thompson sat at one end of the long table, her lawyer beside her, while the board members took their seats. Dr. Collins stood at the front of the room, the video playing silently on the screen behind her. "We are here today," she began, her voice firm, "to address an incident that has exposed serious flaws in our system. But first, Mrs. Thompson, would you like to explain your actions?" Mrs. Thompson's lawyer leaned in, whispering something to her, but she shook her head. The mask of innocence she had worn for so long had finally shattered. "I didn't know he was the principal's son," she said, as if that somehow justified everything. A board member immediately responded, his voice sharp. "Would it have made a difference if you had known? Would that have been the deciding factor in treating him with basic human dignity?" The meeting dragged on for hours. Every complaint was reviewed, every incident discussed. Teachers came forward with their own observations, recounting comments Mrs. Thompson had made in the break room, remarks they had noticed but never challenged as strongly as they should have. Outside, the school had become the center of a much larger conversation. News reporters interviewed parents and community members, all of them demanding change. Social media was flooded with support for Alex and his father, with many people sharing their own experiences of discrimination in schools. By late afternoon, the decisions had been made. Mrs. Thompson's employment was terminated immediately. The board announced a full review of all complaint procedures and the implementation of mandatory bias training for all staff. But everyone knew these were just the first steps toward addressing a much deeper problem. Principal Richardson spent the rest of the day in meetings with district officials, civil rights advocates, and parent representatives. They discussed policy reforms, new training programs, and strategies to create a more inclusive school environment. His unique position, both as an administrator and as a parent, gave him insight that many found invaluable. As the day drew to a close, he finally had a moment to check his phone. There was a message from his wife. Alex was okay. The doctor had treated some mild chemical irritation, but thankfully, there were no serious burns. More importantly, she wrote, Alex was holding his head high, refusing to let this incident break his spirit. That evening, the last person to leave the school was the janitor. He paused in his work, watching as Principal Richardson stood alone in the empty hallway, gazing at the student artwork on the walls. Bright, colorful pieces reflected the diversity of the school community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, in the stillness of the empty school, he could begin planning the changes that would ensure no child ever felt unsafe or unwelcome in these halls again. Walking to his car under the darkening sky, Principal Richardson reflected on how the most difficult lessons often arise from the most painful experiences. The school would never be the same after today, and perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen. 1 week after the incident, the school board hearing room was filled to capacity. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating both familiar and unfamiliar faces. At the front of the room, board members sat behind a long table, their expressions serious as they prepared to address the overflowing crowd. Alex sat between his parents in the front row, his hair carefully covered by a soft cap. The chemical burns had mostly healed, but the damage to his hair had required specialized treatment at a salon. His grandmother sat beside them, a pillar of strength for the entire family. Dr. Collins, the superintendent, stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone. What happened at Springfield Middle School was not just an isolated incident, she began, her voice steady and resolute. It was a wake-up call for our entire district. Behind her, a screen displayed statistics that made many in the audience gasp. Complaints about discriminatory behavior had been filed in schools across the district, yet most had been quietly dismissed or shelved without proper follow-up. The superglue incident had finally forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth. The system had failed too many students for far too long. Mrs. Thompson sat with her lawyer at a small table to the side. In just 1 week, her face had aged years. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Not just the viral video, but years of documented incidents that had now come to light. Former students had stepped forward with their own accounts, painting a picture of long-term discriminatory behavior that could no longer be ignored. The board's decision was unanimous. Mrs. Thompson's teaching license would be revoked. The district would fully cooperate with ongoing investigations by civil rights organizations. But beyond that, sweeping changes would be implemented across all schools. We are establishing an independent review board, Dr. Collins announced. Any complaints of discrimination will be investigated immediately. We are implementing new training programs, revising our hiring practices, and creating student-led diversity councils in every school. Next, Principal Richardson was called to speak. He stepped up to the podium, his posture both professional and deeply personal as he addressed the crowd. As an educator and a father, he began, his voice steady. I've seen this issue from both sides. We need to do better. We will do better. He outlined plans for Springfield Middle School, which would serve as a model for others, regular cultural sensitivity training for all staff, a revised curriculum that celebrated diversity, an anonymous reporting system for students who felt unsafe, and monthly meetings where students could voice their concerns directly to administrators. Community leaders stepped forward to support these changes. Local businesses offered to fund new programs. Civil rights organizations volunteered to provide training. Parents formed committees to help implement the new policies. What had begun as a terrible incident was now transforming into a movement for meaningful change. Alex listened quietly from his seat, sitting between his parents. He thought about his friends at school and how they had stood by him when it mattered most. He thought about Mr. Chun, who had been watching out for him all along. He thought about all the students who might now have a better school experience because of what had happened. During a break in the proceedings, a young student approached Alex. "My little sister is starting school next year," she said softly. "Because of you, she'll be safer." Alex managed a small smile, realizing that his painful experience might help protect others. The hearing stretched into the afternoon. Lawyers debated legal implications, teachers proposed changes to classroom policies, and students shared their experiences and ideas for making schools more inclusive. Every voice was heard. Every suggestion was considered. From his seat, Principal Richardson observed it all, taking careful notes. Changes had already begun at Springfield Middle School. Art supplies were now stored in clear, labeled containers, accessible to all students. Teachers were required to document their grading processes. A new counselor had been hired specifically to support students facing discrimination. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, the board made their final announcements. Mrs. Thompson would never teach again. The district would cover the costs of Alex's medical treatment and hair restoration. New policies would be implemented before the next school year began. But the most significant change wasn't written in any official document. It was in the way people looked at each other with more understanding and awareness. It was in the conversations happening in hallways and classrooms, at dinner tables and community meetings. As Alex walked out of the hearing room, he felt different. The cap on his head still concealed the damage to his hair, but he held his head high. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, both of them knowing that their painful experience had sparked necessary change. "You did good, son," Principal Richardson said quietly as they walked toward their car. Sometimes, the hardest moments lead to the most important changes. Alex nodded, thinking about all the students who would benefit from these new policies. The incident had been painful, but the response from his school and community had shown him something powerful. When people stand together against injustice, real change is possible. That evening, as news crews packed up their equipment and the last cars left the parking lot, the setting sun cast a golden glow over the school board building, symbolizing not just the end of a long day, but the beginning of something new. Inside, custodians cleaned the hearing room while board members finalized paperwork. Outside, new signs were already being installed. Springfield School District, where every student belongs. 6 months after the incident, Springfield Middle School had undergone a transformation. The hallways buzzed with new energy as students hurried to their morning classes. Fresh paint brightened the walls, now adorned with student artwork celebrating diversity and inclusion. But the real changes ran much deeper than surface appearances. Alex walked confidently through the main entrance, his locks healthy and fully restored thanks to the careful work of his grandmother's friend, a specialist who had helped repair the damage. As he made his way to his locker, students greeted him with warm smiles and fist bumps. Gone was the nervous boy who had started the school year. In his place stood a young leader who had helped drive meaningful change. The morning announcements crackled over the speaker system, reminding everyone about the upcoming Unity Fair. Alex smiled, recalling how the idea had originated in one of the new student council meetings. The fair would showcase different cultures, traditions, and stories from the school community. His project, a presentation on the history and significance of different hairstyles, had already generated a lot of interest. Principal Richardson stood in the hallway, watching students pass by. The past few months had been challenging, but also deeply rewarding. The new policies weren't just words on paper, they were making a real difference in students' lives. The anonymous reporting system had already prevented several instances of discrimination. Teachers were more aware, more engaged, and more willing to speak up when they noticed a problem. Even in the teacher's lounge, the atmosphere had shifted. The new diversity training coordinator, Ms. Lee, led weekly discussion groups where staff could openly talk about their biases and learn from each other. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were necessary. Several teachers had admitted that witnessing Mrs. Thompson's downfall had forced them to examine their own unconscious prejudices. At lunch, David, now president of the Student Diversity Council, caught up with Alex. "You're still coming to speak at the elementary school next week, right?" he asked, sliding into his seat. The council had started a mentoring program, visiting younger students to talk about inclusion and standing up against discrimination. "Wouldn't miss it," Alex replied, thinking about how much he had grown since that terrible day in art class. Speaking up had been difficult at first, but now he understood the power of his voice. Other students had started sharing their own experiences too, creating a ripple effect of awareness and change across the district. The superintendent's new policies had expanded to other schools in the area. Springfield Middle School had become a model, hosting educators from different districts who wanted to learn from their experience. Principal Richardson often gave presentations, sharing both the professional and personal aspects of their journey toward genuine inclusion. That afternoon, Alex attended one of the new after-school workshops. Today's session focused on cultural exchange, with students teaching each other about their family's traditions. The room was packed. These voluntary sessions had become surprisingly popular, with students eager to learn about their classmates' backgrounds. From the doorway, Mr. Chun, now head of the school's inclusion committee, watched with satisfaction. "You know," he said to Principal Richardson, who had stopped to observe, "when I first started teaching here, I never thought I'd see changes like this." Later that day, Alex sat in his father's office, reviewing suggestions from the anonymous feedback box. They did this every week, taking each comment seriously. Some were simple requests, like adding more diverse food options in the cafeteria. Others were thoughtful proposals for new programs or concerns about ongoing issues. Each one was given careful consideration. "Look at this one," Alex said, holding up a note. "They want to start a monthly cultural heritage celebration." His father nodded, adding it to their growing list of student-led initiatives. The school had learned that the best ideas often came from the students themselves. As the day drew to a close, Alex packed up his books, pausing to admire the new mural in the main hallway. Painted by students over several weekends, it depicted a diverse group of young people standing together, their differences celebrated rather than hidden. He remembered how the entire school had contributed ideas for the design, making it a true reflection of their community. On the walk home with his father, Alex noticed a moving truck parked outside the school. "The last of Mrs. Thompson's things," Principal Richardson explained quietly. The former teacher had left the state, but her actions had ignited changes that would continue shaping students' experiences for years to come. That evening, at a community dinner celebrating the school's progress, Alex stood to speak. As he looked out at the faces of his classmates, teachers, and neighbors, he saw something that hadn't been there 6 months ago: real understanding, genuine connection, and shared purpose. "What happened to me was painful," he said, his voice strong and steady. "But look at what we've built from it. Every student who walks through those doors now knows they belong here. Every voice matters. Every story deserves to be heard." The applause that followed wasn't just for Alex. It was for every person who had helped turn a moment of hatred into a movement of hope. As the sun set outside, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Springfield Middle School stood as a testament to what was possible when a community refused to let discrimination win, choosing instead to grow, learn, and change together.